First, I would like to mention MAYU Water. If you're trying to upgrade your hydration, MAYU uses a vortex flow system that mimics how water naturally moves in rivers and streams. That motion helps increase oxygenation and release unwanted gases like chlorine, improving overall water quality and making it easier to stay consistently hydrated. But here's what most people overlook. Hydration isn't just about water. It's about minerals and absorption. MAYU allows you to remineralize your water with essential minerals and electrolytes, supporting cellular hydration, energy levels, and overall physiological balance. When your water has the right structure and mineral content, your body can actually use it more efficiently. If you care about hydration, performance, or just feeling better day to day, this is one of those simple upgrades that adds up. You can get 10% off with the code AUTISM. Next, Daylight Computer Company and Daylight Kids. These devices are designed to work with your brain, not against it. And honestly, the future of tech is already here. Most screens are built for stimulation, bright, fast, and attention-grabbing. But that often leads to eye strain, mental fatigue, and disrupted sleep. Daylight takes a different approach. By reducing blue light and lowering overall sensory load, these devices support sustained focus, calmer attention, and healthier sleep patterns. For anyone who feels drained after screen time, or for kids whose nervous systems are still developing, this creates a much more natural, regulated way to engage with technology. If you want your tech to support your brain instead of overstimulating it, this is worth checking out. Use code AUTISM for $50 off. And finally, Chroma light devices, lights designed for humans. Natural light contains a full spectrum that our brains and bodies are tuned to. But most modern indoor lighting falls short of that. It's often narrow, harsh, and out of sync with how we're designed to experience light. Chroma is built to bring that balance back. These lights are designed to better reflect the qualities of natural light, supporting your circadian rhythm, reducing sensory strain, and creating environments that feel calmer and more aligned. That can translate into better sleep, more stable energy, and a nervous system that isn't constantly being pushed toward overload. If you have ever felt off under certain lighting and didn't know why, this is worth exploring. Get 10% off with the code AUTISM. If you're optimizing your environment, your focus, your well-being, your nervous system, these products are worth checking out. So this is part 2 of the Autism and the Structure of Reality. In the last episode, we talked about the self. Not personality per se, not identity as something assigned, but the self as something deeper, structured, consistent, and real. And we talked about a paradox. Autism comes from the word self. But many people who live with it are pressured to move away from how they naturally operate. Now that tension between the individual and the world is not new. This isn't about saying these thinkers were describing autism. They were exploring a timeless human tension. What happens when an individual internal structure doesn't align with the collective patterns around them? Today we are applying that thinking to a very modern experience. Long before modern psychology, thinkers were trying to understand it. Not autism specifically, but something more fundamental. What happens when the way a person experiences and organizes reality does not align with the structure of the society around them. For Nietzsche describes something he called the herd, not as an insult, but as a description of how groups stabilize themselves. This herd reinforces shared values, reduces variation, maintains predictability, because predictability allows systems to function. Without it, everything becomes harder. Communication, coordination, and expectation. Remember the episode on the corollary discharge, and remember how humans, especially our brains, are a prediction machine. So this system develops norms, and those norms don't just guide behavior, they define what is acceptable. They pave what is certain, and humans love that. Nietzsche frequently spoke about the immediate certainty. Now here's where Nietzsche becomes relevant. He argued that the herd does not evaluate difference purely on truth. He evaluates differences based on its effect on stability. He said, the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. This use of overwhelmed is relevant to the autistic phenotype and to many. He wasn't talking about the loner or introvert. He was warning that the herd's instinct for self-preservation often mistakes any deviation for danger. The pressure can be gentle, like a raised eyebrow, a correction, or just try to fit in, or it can be relentless. So, difference can be rejected for multiple reasons. Sometimes because it is harmful, sometimes because it is misunderstood, and often because it disrupts the pattern. But Nietzsche pushes this idea further into something much deeper. He wrote, our highest insights must and should sound like follies, and sometimes like crimes when they are heard without permission by those who are not predisposed or predestined for them. Because he's not just saying that new ideas sound strange. He's saying that understanding itself depends on the structure of the person hearing it. The insight doesn't change, but the interpretation does. To one person, something may sound precise, meaningful, accurate. To the other person, it might sound confusing, irrational, or even wrong. Not because the idea lacks value, but because it does not fit within the structure that is receiving it. Now bring that forward. If someone processes information differently, prioritizes different signals, organizes experiences in a different way, then what they see may not translate. Not because it lacks meaning, but because the listener does not have the structure to receive it. And that's where the breakdown begins. Sometimes something sounds wrong, not because it is wrong, but because it cannot be understood within the system that's hearing it. Nietzsche also argued something deeper. Most people do not become who they are. They become what they are shaped into. Values are inherited. Behavior is modeled. Identity is reinforced externally. So the average developmental path is absorb, adapt, align. Can you fit in or not? Are you like the so-called normal people or not? As we discussed Jung in the previous episode, when the persona doesn't form in the typical way, the self stays more central. The system, however, is built for the opposite path. Now consider what happens when that process is reduced or altered. If someone is less driven by imitation, social reinforcement, external validation, then development may rely more heavily on internal consistency, structural understanding, direct interaction with systems. That creates a divergence. Not better, not worse, just different. But the differences mean the individual is no longer being shaped primarily by the group. And that introduces tension, because now the system is not just guiding behavior, it is trying to realign it. Some people are shaped by the world. Others develop from within and then have to negotiate the world. Next, I'd like to talk about Søren Kierkegaard. I like Kierkegaard because he brought a very religious aspect to his work. Kierkegaard approached this from a different angle. He wasn't focused on systems in the way as Nietzsche was. He was focused on the self and what happens to it under pressure. He argued that the greatest danger is not standing out. It's disappearing into the crowd. He put it bluntly with, the crowd is untruth. Now that sounds extreme, but what he's pointing to is structural. Kierkegaard wasn't saying all community is bad. He meant that when the crowd becomes the source of truth and identity, the individual self dissolves. For those who never fully merged into it, the cost of belonging is clearer. But so is the cost of standing apart. When identity is defined externally, the individual becomes passive. Responsibility is reduced. And the process of becoming is replaced with imitation. The answers are already given. What to value, how to act, what to prioritize. And over time, that becomes identity. Not discovered, but adopted. Who owns you is a fantastic question that you could ask yourself multiple times a day even. Now connect that to what we've been building here. If someone does not naturally merge into the crowd, they avoid one problem. They don't lose themselves into it, but they encounter another. They exist outside of it. And that creates a different kind of tension. Not just social tension, but structural tension in how the self is maintained. Because Kierkegaard adds something critical. The self is not just something you have. It is something you must actively relate to. It is a dynamic process, a continuous alignment between what you are and how you exist in the world. Now imagine what happens when the external world keeps pushing you toward a version of yourself that does not match your internal structure. That alignment becomes unstable, not because the self is weak, but because the demands are incompatible. So the tension is not just, I don't fit in. It becomes, I am being asked to become something that does not match how I am organized. And that creates a specific kind of pressure because maintaining alignment now requires effort. It requires awareness, resistance, and constant adjustment. Not to become someone else, but to avoid becoming someone else. And over time, that can lead to different outcomes. One, the person adapts to the system. They reduce themselves. They simplify. They move toward what is expected. Alignment decreases. Stability increases. Or two, they maintain alignment with their internal structure. But now they carry the cost of friction, misunderstanding, and distance from the crowd. And this is where Kierkegaard becomes especially relevant. Because for him, the self is not defined by comfort or acceptance. It is defined by truth to itself. So the question shifts, not, how do I fit? But what does it cost to remain aligned with what I actually am? And more importantly, what happens if I don't? Because the danger, in Kierkegaard's view, is not discomfort. It's losing the self entirely. Not all at once, but gradually, through small adjustments, small compromises, small shifts toward what is easier, until the external version replaces the internal one. The crowd offers belonging, but belonging often comes at the cost of alignment with the self. Dostoevsky explored something less structural and more experiential. This might be complicated here. Dostoevsky is a very fascinating character. He focused on what it feels like when internal experience does not align with external life, but not as abstract theory, as lived, often painful, human experience. What it feels like when your internal world cannot be reduced to fit the external one. His characters rarely struggle because they lack ability. They struggle because they have too much of it. They think deeply. They feel intensely. They process far more layers than the situation seems to require. Think of the underground man in Notes from the Underground. Hyper-aware, paralyzed, caught in the contradictions of his own thinking. Unable, and often unwilling, to play the simplified social game that others accept without question. Whereas Kolnikov in Crime and Punishment, whose internal moral and intellectual complexity collides with the flat, practical demands of everyday life. Those are not people who can't function. They are people whose internal processing is richer, more detailed, more layered, and therefore far less compressible. And that distinction matters. Because everyday interaction depends on compression, quick signals, shared assumptions, reduced detail, simplified responses. Remember the episode on autism and intuition, the differences. But deeper processing resists that compression. The more faithfully someone tracks reality in its full complexity, the harder it becomes to reduce it to the shorthand the crowd expects. What feels precise internally can appear slow, intense, or misaligned externally. But the issue is not just depth, it's translation. What is coherent internally must be compressed to be expressed externally. And when that compression fails, the system judges the output without access to the process that produced it. So something that is actually structured, detailed, internally consistent, can be interpreted as unclear, disorganized, or wrong. Dostoevsky captured the heart of this in one piercing line. To go wrong in one's own way is better than to go right in someone else's. That isn't a celebration of stubbornness. It's a declaration of alignment. It is better to remain faithful to your own internal structure, even if it leads you outside the system, than to abandon it in order to match expectations that were never built for you. The more detail you keep, the harder it is to translate it into something the world can easily accept. Across Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Dostoevsky, three very different thinkers here, there is a consistent pattern. The system prioritizes stability. The individual introduces variation. Variation creates tension, and tension leads to pressure. And that pattern is not theoretical. It is still active. Right now, the human being is very fascinating. In modern systems, schools, workplaces, social environments, norms are still enforced, reinforced, and often unquestioned. And when someone operates outside those norms, the response is still correction, pressure, or misunderstanding. Time changes language. It does not eliminate the tension. Here's where this becomes important. The barrier is not just that someone is different. The barrier is how that difference is interpreted. If differences is seen as error, it gets corrected. Threat, it gets resisted. Confusion, it gets dismissed. But if differences seen as alternative structure, different processing, or unexplored capability, then the response changes. Now the system has to expand. And expansion is harder than correction. It is easier to correct the individual than to expand the system. What we're talking about is expanding the axioms of human life, human existence, and experience. And this shows up when a child is told to make eye contact, or stop stimming, or stop fixating. Stop learning so much about that thing. And not because it is harmful. It is not a physical insult. But it is because the so-called odd, eccentric, or quirky behaviors disrupts the expected pattern. We're thinking about adults with autism. They don't fit into the work culture or the communication style of the workplace. So they don't fit in. They don't get promoted. The interpretation is the error versus alternative structure determines the response. So these thinkers were not describing autism, but they were describing something real, the tension between internal structure and external expectation. And that tension doesn't disappear with time. It just shows up in new forms. For some people, it's subtle. For others, it's constant. But the question remains, do you reshape yourself to match the system? Or do you find a new way to bring your structure into it? Because the traits that create friction, the depth, precision, differences in processing, are often the same traits that solve problems, reveal patterns, and move the system forward. The system resists what it doesn't understand until it learns it needs it. So are you compromising your life, your internal organization, your true self, for something else, for something externally, maybe to fit in? And for who? For what? And at what cost? If you're listening to the podcast, listening to the episode, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge, and I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me on X at RPS47586, or you can email info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. You can check out the YouTube page where you can see full-length videos, shorts, and clips. You can just reach out and contact me over any of these topics. I love to talk about these things. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.